Get your hands off that table. This section is reserved, and you clearly don't belong here." The words didn't come from a whisper. They came from across the dining room, loud enough that 3 nearby tables went quiet, forks suspended mid-air, wine glasses held still. Isaiah Drummond didn't flinch. He was 41 years old, and he had learned a long time ago that flinching only encouraged people. He sat with his hands folded in front of him, a glass of water untouched to his left, a slim leather portfolio closed on the table's edge. He wore dark slacks, a simple grey Henley, and a pair of running shoes that had seen better days. His jacket, a nondescript black windbreaker, hung from the back of his chair. There was no watch on his wrist, no designer logo anywhere, just a man sitting quietly in a restaurant the way paying customers do. The man now standing over him was Connor Baxter, 44, floor manager at the Alderton, which was the kind of restaurant in downtown Chicago that printed menus without prices because the clientele who mattered already knew what things cost, and the rest weren't supposed to get that far. Connor had the posture of a man who confused control over a dining room with power in the world. He was trim in a dark suit, with an earpiece that connected to nothing more urgent than the hostess stand, and eyes that had already decided everything about Isaiah before a single word was exchanged. "Sir," Connor said, though it didn't sound like a form of respect, "this table has been reserved for a private party. You'll need to move immediately." Isaiah looked up at him. His face was calm. Not blank. Calm. There is a difference that most people in Connor's position never learn to recognize. Blank is the absence of feeling. Calm is the presence of it, held carefully, used deliberately. "I have a reservation," Isaiah said. 7 o'clock, table 12. "My name is Isaiah Drummond." Connor's smile had the thinness of someone who had rehearsed patience but never actually felt it. He lifted a small black tablet and tapped the screen twice. "I don't see that here." "Check again." The words were quiet, no edge in them, just instruction. Connor checked. His jaw shifted slightly. He turned the screen so Isaiah couldn't see it, which meant whatever he found there was not what he had expected to find. "There may have been a system error," Connor said. "These things happen. We can seat you in our overflow lounge while we sort this out." The overflow lounge was visible from where Isaiah sat. It was adjacent to the kitchen, separated from the main dining room by a frosted glass partition, and the suggestion that the people seated there were not quite the same caliber as the people on this side of it. Isaiah did not look toward the lounge. He looked at Connor. "I didn't book the overflow lounge," he said. "I booked table 12, which is where I'm sitting." A sound moved through the nearest tables. Not a gasp. More like an intake of collective breath, the kind that happens when something is said out loud, that everyone in the room was already thinking. Connor straightened. There was a woman watching from near the host stand, about 20 feet away. Marlene Voss, 58, senior dining coordinator, and the person who had worked at the Alderton long enough that the original owner had personally trained her. She had silver hair pulled back tight, reading glasses on a chain, and a face that had processed 40 years of human behavior in expensive restaurants and learned to read a room before a room read itself. She was reading this one now. Connor wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the table to Isaiah's left, where a woman in a cream cashmere wrap had just arrived, standing with a small entourage of 3, gesturing toward table 12, with the confidence of someone directing a scene in a film she had already produced. Her name was Vivienne Hartwell, 62, founder of the Hartwell Group, a real estate development company with enough political connections in the city to make building permits appear and disappear like magic. She dressed the way wealthy women dress. When they want you to know, they stopped caring what you thought about their money 3 decades ago, which meant she dressed expensively and without apology. "Connor," Vivienne said, her voice carrying the register of someone who expected to be heard without raising it. "I specifically asked for 12. It's my table." I've sat there every Thursday for 11 years. Connor pivoted toward her with a softness in his posture that had been completely absent 60 seconds earlier. Mrs. Hartwell, of course. We're just working through a small mix-up. I don't have time for a mix-up. She didn't look at Isaiah. That was the particular form her dismissal took. Not cruelty with eye contact, but the absence of acknowledgement. The kind of erasure that said, "You are not a person whose presence I need to process." Isaiah placed his phone face down on the table. Screen up would have changed everything, because the screen contained a message from his assistant sent 4 minutes ago. Pre-dinner call with Okafor, and the legal team confirmed. FYI, the Alderton's ownership transfer paperwork was in the 2 p.m. packet you signed. Congratulations, Mr. Drummond. You now own the building. He did not show the screen. He had learned that too. Connor turned back to Isaiah with the full weight of his decision already made. Sir, I'm going to need to ask you to relocate. We have a long-standing arrangement with Mrs. Hartwell. And a long-standing arrangement, Isaiah repeated. His voice was still even. Is that in the reservation system? Or is that a different kind of arrangement? The question hung in the air like smoke. A man at the table directly across. Late 50s. Silver at the temples. The sort of person who looked like he'd seen a lot of things in hotel dining rooms and private clubs and boardrooms. Lowered his menu and watched without pretending to read. Vivienne finally looked at Isaiah. It was a brief look, inventory style, the kind that catalogued windbreaker, running shoes, absence of accessories, and drew conclusions. Connor, she said, handle this. Yes, ma'am. He leaned slightly toward Isaiah, lowering his voice to the register men like him used when they wanted to sound reasonable while being anything but. Mr. Drummond, I'm trying to make this easy for you, if you'll just— You're trying to make this easy for you, Isaiah said. Silence. The man across the aisle with the silver temples stopped pretending he wasn't listening. Connor's composure had a crack in it now, thin as a fault line but visible if you knew where to look. Sir, you looked at my reservation. You saw my name. The table is confirmed and I am sitting in it. Isaiah folded his hands. If Mrs. Hartwell has a concern about her booking, that's a conversation between her and your management. I am not the conversation. A woman 2 tables back made a small sound. Not quite a laugh. The kind of sound that escapes before you decide to let it. Vivienne Hartwell did not like that sound. Her chin rose precisely 1 degree. This is a private establishment, she said, addressing Isaiah directly now because erasure had stopped working. And the staff here knows how to manage their guests appropriately. Isaiah looked at her. What does appropriately mean to you? She blinked. People like Vivienne Hartwell were asked many things. They were asked for opinions, for donations, for their preferred wine. They were rarely asked to define their own words. It means, she said carefully, that certain standards exist here, and you're concerned that I don't meet them. It wasn't a question. It didn't need to be. The table to Vivienne's left had gone completely still. The couple there were in their mid-40s, Thomas and Jean Nakamura, both professors at Northwestern, who had come to the Alderton for a wedding anniversary. They had been eating in comfortable quiet until 60 seconds ago. Now, Jean's fork rested on her plate, and her eyes moved between Isaiah and Vivienne with an expression that was trying to settle somewhere between disbelief and recognition. Thomas put his hand on Jean's and said nothing. Connor attempted to recalibrate. Look, what we're offering you is a perfectly equivalent. Is it equivalent? Isaiah asked. Or is it what you offer the people you'd like to stop looking at? The question didn't have anger in it. That was what made it land so hard. Connor felt the room shift. He had managed the Alderton's dining floor for 9 years, and he had navigated 100 situations. That required careful hands. But careful hands require a situation where the architecture of power is clear, where the person with less of it backs down in proportion to their awareness of that deficit. Isaiah Drummond was not backing down, and what was worse, He was doing it without rage, which meant Connor couldn't use rage as the story. "I'll get the head of operations," Connor said finally. "That would be fine," Isaiah said. Connor walked with controlled speed toward the back of the dining room. Vivian remained standing near table 12 with her entourage, which now numbered 4, including a young woman who appeared to be her assistant, and who had spent the last 2 minutes looking at her phone with growing alarm. Marlene Voss had not moved from the host stand. She was watching Connor disappear through the kitchen corridor, and then watching Isaiah, and then watching Vivian, and doing the arithmetic that 38 years of hospitality work taught you to do fast, and without showing your calculations. She had seen the reservation. She had processed it at 3 in the afternoon. She had also seen who had called the restaurant at 4:30 to insist that table 12 be cleared for Mrs. Hartwell, Thursday as always. That call had come from Connor. Marlene held her tablet against her chest and didn't move toward anyone. Vivienne adjusted the clasp of her handbag and looked at Isaiah with something new in her expression. Not quite discomfort. More like the early stage of it, the point just before a person recognizes that the script they arrived with may not be the one playing out. "You know," she said, her tone shifting to something that would have passed as conciliatory if it had contained any actual conciliation. "I don't have a problem with you personally. These things are just about logistics." "Tell me what the logistics are," Isaiah said. "Excuse me, the logistics. You said this is about logistics. Tell me what they are." He gestured toward the room. "There are several open tables. You chose to have me removed from this one specifically. Walk me through the logistics." Vivienne's jaw tightened. One of her companions, a man in his 50s with the build of someone who had once played football and the expression of someone who wished he still could, stepped half a pace closer. Not threateningly, instinctively. The instinct of men who stand near wealthy women to signal that standing near wealthy women is itself a form of authority. Isaiah noticed. He looked at the man once, briefly, then back at Vivian. The man's name was Douglas Fane, 57, VP of External Affairs at the Hartwell Group. And he had been with Vivian for 19 years. He had seen her in situations like this before, or what he'd thought were situations like this. He now felt the subtle pull of uncertainty, the way you feel it on a frozen lake. When you hear something underneath the ice that you can't quite identify, he didn't step back. But he didn't step closer either. The man with the silver temples at the table across had put his menu down fully now. He was watching without pretending not to. His name was Kenneth Osei, 61, a retired federal judge from the Northern District of Illinois who had come to the Alderton for a quiet dinner after a speaking engagement at the law school. He had spent 32 years watching people under pressure, and what he saw in Isaiah Drummond was one of the most disciplined performances of restraint he had encountered outside a courtroom. Kenneth said nothing. He watched. Vivian's response was interrupted by the return of Connor Baxter, now accompanied by a woman who carried the posture of someone whose job required her to fix things before they became things that required fixing. Her name was Sylvia Crane, 49, Director of Operations at the Alderton. She wore a charcoal blazer, had her phone in one hand, and a quiet fury in her eyes that had nothing to do with Isaiah Drummond, and everything to do with being pulled from a staffing call to manage something that should never have escalated this far. She arrived at table 12, took one look at the scene, and her expression did several things at once. "Mr. Drummond," she said, "I'm Sylvia Crane. I'm the operations director." "Ems Crane," Isaiah said. "I understand there's been a seating dispute. I want to personally apologize for any confusion." "It's not a confusion," Connor cut in. "Mrs. Hartwell has standing accommodation here and—" "Connor." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. He stopped. Sylvia looked at Isaiah. "You have a confirmed reservation for table 12 at 7 o'clock. Is that correct?" "It is." She turned to Connor. Did you see that reservation in the system? A beat. There was an apparent yes or no, Connor. The dining room had gone extraordinarily still. The servers, 2 of them, had drifted near the service station and were no longer moving. Kenneth Osei had leaned back in his chair with the unhurried posture of a man prepared to wait as long as it took. Yes, Connor said. Then there is no confusion, Sylvia said. She turned to Vivian Hartwell, and her tone did not change. Mrs. Hartwell, we are delighted to have you this evening. We have table 9 available, which I believe is near the window that I always sit at 12. Vivian's voice had taken on the tone that wealth sometimes produces when it has been forced to wait. Not quite anger, not quite entitlement, but a hybrid of both that carries a century of social conditioning inside every syllable. I understand, Sylvia said. Tonight, table 12 is occupied. The room waited. Vivian looked at Isaiah. Isaiah was looking at his water glass. He picked it up, drank from it, set it down. Vivian Hartwell, in 42 years of doing business in this city, had not often encountered a man who did not meet her gaze during a confrontation. It unsettled her in a way she didn't have a name for immediately. She opened her mouth. She closed it. Douglas shifted his weight. Then something happened that no one expected. A young woman stood up from a corner table near the window, where she had been sitting alone over a half-eaten plate of salmon. She was 29, in a burgundy blazer, with natural hair pulled up, and she had been filming on her phone for the last 4 minutes, with the phone resting against her water glass at an angle that looked like negligence, but was anything but. Her name was Camille Warren, a freelance journalist from Chicago who covered food, hospitality, and what she called the architecture of public space. How physical environments encoded social hierarchies, who was welcomed, who was watched, who was asked to move. She had come to review the Alderton's new tasting menu. She was no longer thinking about the tasting menu. "Excuse me," Camille said, not loudly, just clearly. "I've been watching this for several minutes. This man showed his reservation. He was asked to move anyway, and I just watched a staff member confirm he had a valid booking." She looked at Sylvia, then at Connor. "That's what happened. I want to make sure I have it right before I write anything." The word right did something to the room. Douglas took a step back. Connor's face did a complicated series of things. Vivian looked at Camille with the specific expression of someone recalibrating how much of a problem this evening might become. Kenneth Osei placed his elbows on the table and laced his fingers together. Sylvia Crane looked at Camille, then at Connor, then at the pocket of his jacket, where something thick and rectangular had been slipping out slightly as he'd walked. A fold of bills, not a receipt, not a card, a fold. Sylvia went very still. "Connor," she said, quietly enough that only the nearest table could hear, "step into the corridor." "It's not now," he went. Sylvia looked back at Isaiah. "Mr. Drummond, you are seated at table 12. I apologize that this reached the level it did. It should not have," she paused. "Your meal tonight is on us." "Thank you," Isaiah said, "but that's not necessary." "It is," she said simply. Vivian Hartwell stood at the edge of table 12 with her entourage, and the specific silence of a person who has run out of moves. She looked at Douglas. He looked at the floor. "Table 9. Vivian said finally, to no one in particular. "Right this way," said a server who had materialized with the smooth precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this word. Isaiah watched them go. Then he opened his portfolio and took out a single sheet of paper, the kind that doesn't need color or design, because the content is the design. He set it on the table, and he read it quietly to himself for a moment, the way a person reads something they've already memorized, but want to see in print one more time. The paper confirmed the completion of the Drummond capital acquisition of the Alderton Restaurant Group, effective that morning at 9 a.m. He had owned the building, and the restaurant in it. For 10 hours, Warren had not sat back down. She was still standing at her table, and she was looking at Isaiah now with the expression of someone who has been covering a story, and just realized the story has a second floor. She crossed the room and stopped a respectful distance from his table. "I'm sorry for the intrusion," she said. "Camille Warren, I'm a journalist. I know who you are," Isaiah said. He did. He had read her work. It was precise, fair, and it saw things that most people in her field were content not to see. "Please sit down, Miss Warren, if you'd like." She sat. At the host stand, Marlene Voss watched the two of them and let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 12 minutes. She put her tablet under her arm and took out her personal phone and did something she had not done in 9 years of working at the Alderton. She opened her notes app and began to type a document she labeled, quietly and without ceremony, "What I saw tonight." By the time Vivian Hartwell's entree arrived at table 9, the video Camille Warren had posted 40 minutes earlier had been shared by 2 Chicago news accounts, a national food media newsletter, and a civil rights reporter at a major newspaper who had been looking for a follow-up story on service discrimination in upscale dining. By the time Vivian's dessert was cleared, the Hartwell Group's PR director had called 3 times. Vivian didn't answer. She sat at table 9, which was near a window, which had a better view of the street than table 12, and which she had never noticed before, because she had spent 11 years looking at the same wall. She thought about the man in the grey Henley. She thought about what he had said. "Walk me through the logistics." She hadn't answered. She still couldn't. In the back corridor of the Alderton, Sylvia Crane was on the phone with her own attorney by 7:45. Connor Baxter was filling out a statement for the restaurant's internal incident report. His employment, pending review, had been suspended effective that night. The fold of bills in his jacket, a sum from Douglas Fane, passed on Vivian's instruction before she'd entered the dining room, had been photographed and preserved. Douglas had not said a single word in the dining room after the moment he stepped back from Vivian. He understood with the wordless clarity of a man who had managed corporate exposure for 2 decades that he had just watched something he would spend a long time explaining to lawyers. Kenneth Osei finished his dinner at his own pace. He left a generous tip. As he passed Isaiah's table on the way out, he paused for a moment. "Well handled," he said. Isaiah looked up. "Thank you, sir. I spent 30 years on the federal bench," Kenneth said. "I've seen a lot of people under a lot of pressure." He paused. "The restraint you showed tonight is rarer than the power you obviously have." Isaiah looked at him. "My mother used to say that anger is a gift you give people who are hoping for it. I try not to be generous with it." Kenneth smiled. It was the smile of a man who had heard wisdom and recognized it. He nodded once and walked away. Camille Warren had stayed through dinner. Not to interview Isaiah, she hadn't asked him a single question about himself. Because she was a good journalist, and she understood that what mattered tonight wasn't him. What mattered was the pattern, the architecture of the room, who was asked to prove their presence, who was granted it without asking. They talked about Chicago, about her work, about the salmon she'd barely touched, about a tasting menu she'd been hired to review that had somehow become something else entirely. When the check came, Isaiah paid it. The server told him twice that Miss Crane had insisted it was on her, and Isaiah told the server twice that it wasn't, and eventually everyone settled into the reality that the man who owned the building was going to handle the check. Walking out through the main dining room, past the place where Connor had stood over him with that tablet and that thin smile, Isaiah stopped for a moment. He looked at table 12, empty now, set for tomorrow's service, white tablecloth and clean silverware, nothing remarkable about it. A busser crossed nearby, a young man in his early 20s, moving fast with a tray of water glasses. He glanced at Isaiah for just a second, and then did the thing that very few people in the Alderton had done that evening. He smiled, genuine. A little uncertain, maybe, but genuine. Isaiah nodded at him. Outside on the sidewalk, the city moved around him in the indifferent, beautiful way Chicago moves in late October. Wind off the lake, lights bouncing off wet pavement. Cabs, buses, people heading somewhere with their collars up. Camille was beside him. She had her recorder in her pocket and her phone in her hand, the video still getting notifications. "Can I ask you one thing?" she said. Isaiah turned to her. "Why didn't you just tell them who you were?" He thought about that for a moment. The street noise filled the space where he wasn't talking. "Because I shouldn't have had to," he said. Camille looked at him. She opened her mouth and then closed it, because there was nothing to add to that, and she knew it. She stood there on the sidewalk, with the notification still coming in, and she thought about the dining room, and the white tablecloth, and the man in the grey Henley, sitting calmly, while people arranged the room around their own and she thought about all the people who had been asked to move and had moved, because they weren't who Isaiah Drummond was, and nobody filmed it, and it didn't go anywhere, and the table stayed empty for someone who preferred it. "I'm going to write this," she said. "I know," he said. He buttoned his windbreaker against the October wind and started walking. The next morning, the Alderton issued a public statement. It acknowledged the incident. It used the word regret 4 times and the word sorry once. At the end, in a sentence so carefully constructed it technically said everything and admitted nothing. Isaiah Drummond's communications team responded the same afternoon with a statement of 3 sentences. The third sentence noted that as the new owner of the Alderton Restaurant Group, Mr. Drummond had already initiated a review of all hiring, training, and guest accommodation policies across all properties to be completed within 60 days. Connor Baxter's employment was terminated. Douglas Fane resigned from the Hartwell Group 2 weeks later, before the firm's attorneys could formalize what was coming. Vivian Hartwell spent 4 months in negotiations with Isaiah's legal team over the matter of inducing restaurant staff toward discriminatory treatment of a guest. She did not win those negotiations. Camille Warren's piece ran in a national publication. It was titled simply, "A Table of Their Own," on who gets to stay. It did not mention Isaiah's title. It did not mention his company or his ownership stake. It mentioned his shoes. Running shoes, slightly scuffed, comfortable enough for city walking, and the way he had sat at his table the same way anyone sits at a table they've paid for, without performance or apology. The response was significant. Marlene Voss was offered the interim general manager position while permanent leadership was recruited. She accepted. She kept the document she had written that night in her notes app, and she referenced it when she was asked, later, what the Alderton needed to change first. The first change was the training protocol for reservation management. Not because reservations had been the problem. A confirmed booking had existed from 3 in the afternoon. The problem was the culture that let one manager erase it with a phone call and assume no one would notice or, if they noticed, would do anything about it. The second change was the language used when escalating guests' concerns. The third was the process for resolving competing requests. The fourth was the accountability structure that had allowed 11 years of informal accommodation to harden into something that felt like policy without ever being written down. There were others. Isaiah visited the Alderton 3 weeks after the incident. He sat at the bar, ordered coffee and the poached egg dish that had been on the menu since the restaurant opened, and talked to 3 servers and 1 line cook about what they liked about working there and what they didn't. He did not sit at table 12. He did the following week, though, quietly. On a Tuesday, when the room was half full and the light through the windows was the particular pale gold that downtown Chicago gets in mid-November, when the city has accepted winter was coming and stopped arguing about it. He had coffee and the salmon and a document he was reviewing, and left a 25% tip for a server named Aaliyah, who had checked on him 3 times without hovering, the way good servers do. On the way out, she said, Thank you for coming back. He stopped at the door. Thank you for being here, he said, and he meant the thing beneath the words. The thing that was true of Alia and of Camille and of Marlene and of Kenneth Osei, who had simply watched and understood, and of Margaret's counterpart in a room a few weeks prior, the woman who had said, "I know what I'm looking at," while everyone else was still deciding. The city was all around him when he stepped outside, wide and cold and permanent in the way only cities built on water tend to feel. He walked toward his car with his hands in the pockets of the same windbreaker. Behind him, through the glass door, the Alderton continued its evening service. Table 12 was set for a 7 o'clock reservation. The name on the booking was, same as it had been 3 weeks ago, the same as it was going to be from now on. Drummond. Not because he needed the table, because the table had always been his.